Hey Mark, do you want a little panning on this and zooming and stuff?
Is that mine too?
Yep, we have a whole box. We have someone coming.
You know about
Our system is going just fine.
well, it's starting to all right. Okay.
My name is Heidi Shoup, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Washington. And on behalf of the Council, I would like to welcome you all here tonight. The size of our audience indicates how much interest there is in the subject at hand, so I will be as brief as possible in our speakers. Before introducing them, however, I must take care of some administrative announcements. I would like to call your attention to our program tomorrow evening, part of our Foreign Policy series. It is Advancing Democracy Across the Globe, with Lauren Craner, the President of the International Republican Institute, and Kenneth Wallach, the President of the National Democratic Institute. The evening will be moderated by Thomas Crothers, the Vice President for Studies, International Politics and Governance at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This evening, we began a half an hour earlier than usual in an effort to allow as much time as possible for questions and answers. Our speakers will need to be on their way to the airport at 8 o'clock, so we will begin with their comments for about 45 minutes, then address questions until 7:30, and that will allow just half an hour for the book signing at the end. In the interest of getting to as many questions as possible, given the time available, we ask that you make use of the cards provided to jot down your questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll ask that you pass the cards to the aisles, and we will be collecting those for the authors. As a courtesy to our speakers, please turn off your cell phones and pagers at this time. Tonight, our speakers will be talking about their book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. John J. Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Program on International Security Policy at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1982. A West Point graduate, Dr. Mearsheimer received his PhD in political science from Cornell University. He has written extensively about security issues and international politics, and has written a number of op-ed pieces for the New York Times dealing with topics like Bosnia, the failure of the Arab-Israeli peace efforts, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq, among others. Stephen M. Walt is Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and was academic dean of the Kennedy School from 2002 until 2006. He received his BA from Stanford and a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He too has written a number of award-winning books and articles on international security issues and numerous articles in foreign policy and international security journals. We will begin this evening with Dr. Walt. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the World Affairs Council here in Washington for inviting us to come speak about our book, and particularly thank Heidi for the very nice introduction. We are looking forward first to our presentation, but also to answering questions and comments once we're done. We are going to discuss two main questions this evening. First, is there a powerful pro-Israel lobby in the United States, and if so, how does it work? And second, on balance, is its influence positive or negative for the United States, but also for Israel? Now, I'm going to tackle the first of those questions, and John will address the second. But before I get started, I want to acknowledge how difficult it is to raise this subject and why it does need to be handled with some sensitivity. If we were here to talk about energy policy, it would be natural for us to talk about the political activities of oil companies. If we were talking about gun control, you wouldn't be surprised if I mentioned the National Rifle Association. If the subject was the recent U.S.-India nuclear agreement, discussing the lobbying activities of Indian American groups would be unexceptionable. But when the subject is U.S. Middle East policy, and you bring up the Israel lobby, you're reaching out and grabbing the third rail. Now, this is partly because some groups in the lobby are quick to attack anyone who questions their policies, the policies they're pushing, or questioning Israeli policy itself. But it's also because this entire discussion takes place in the shadow of centuries of anti-Semitism, including bizarre conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and of course tragic events like the Holocaust. And that history shapes how people think about this issue and talk about this issue. If you talk about a powerful interest group that is mostly, though by no means exclusively, comprised of Jewish Americans, some may think that you're saying there is some kind of secret conspiracy to control U.S. foreign policy. If you say that media coverage in the United States tends to favor Israel, it sounds like you're making the old charge that Jews control the media. If you talk about campaign contributions by pro-Israel political action committees, some people will think you're saying that Jewish money is doing something improper or illicit. I want to make it clear at the outset that John and I reject every one of those various anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. For us, the Israel lobby is an interest group, just like lots of other interest groups in America. Most of its activities are as American as apple pie. We don't question Israel's legitimacy or its right to exist, and we in fact believe the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival is ever in jeopardy. We also think that the activities of the Israel lobby and its impact on U.S. foreign policy are subjects that reasonable people ought to be able to discuss openly, the same way we would discuss any other groups that try to influence American policy, domestic or foreign. All right, with that as background, let me say a little bit more about this whole subject. The late Yitzhak Rabin once said that U.S. support for Israel was beyond compare in modern history. He was right. It's the largest recipient of U.S. economic and military aid, works out to about $500 per year for each Israeli citizen, even though Israel's per capita income is now 29th in the world. It's not a poor country like Bangladesh or Burundi. And it gets this aid even when it does things that the United States formally opposes, like building settlements in the West Bank. Israel also gets consistent diplomatic backing from the United States, and we almost always take its side in regional disputes. Israel is rarely, if ever, criticized by American officials, and certainly not by anyone who aspires to high office. The people who are now running for president are going to disagree on many issues. We already see that in the campaign. But all of them are already going to considerable lengths to show how personally committed they are to Israel. And the question is why? Now, the usual answer is that Israel is a vital strategic asset and a country that shares our values. Viewed objectively, however, those two arguments can't explain why the United States gives so much help and so unconditionally. Israel may have been a strategic asset during the Cold War, but the Cold War is now over. Today, giving Israel nearly unconditional support is one of the reasons we have a terrorism problem, and it makes it harder to address a range of other problems throughout the Middle East. Now, support for Israel is hardly the only source of anti-Americanism, and our problems in the Middle East would not disappear if the United States had a more normal relationship with Israel. The United States does benefit from some forms of strategic cooperation with Israel. But again, giving it nearly unconditional backing is not making Americans safer now. On balance, it's become a strategic liability. As for the other main argument, that it's a democracy that shares our values, it's certainly true. Israel's a democracy with many admirable qualities, but there are lots of other democracies with equally admirable qualities in the world, and none of them gets the level of support that Israel does. Plus, Israel's treatment of its own Arab citizens, and especially its treatment of the Palestinians, is at odds with American values. Nor is Israel's behavior historically significantly better than that of the Palestinians. I don't have time to go into the details here, but any reasonably fair-minded look at the history of this region, including the more recent histories written by Israeli historians, shows that both sides of this conflict have done many cruel things to each other. Neither side owns the moral high ground here. And please note, I am not saying that Israel acts worse than other countries do, only that it doesn't act any better. And so one cannot justify unconditional U.S. support by saying Israel's behavior is somehow exemplary. Finally, I want to emphasize again that we think there's a strong moral case for Israel's existence based on the long history of anti-Semitism, and we believe that the United States should come to its aid if its survival is at risk. But its existence today is fortunately not at risk, and past crimes against the Jewish people do not justify giving Israel a blank check today. So what explains its privileged position? In our view, it's primarily due to the activities of the Israel lobby. What's the lobby and how does it work? The lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and groups that work openly to move American foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. This includes organizations like AIPAC, the Conference of Presidents, the Zionist Organization of America, Christians United for Israel, plus think tanks like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, American Enterprise Institute, and publications like the Weekly Standard or the New Republic. Now, that's a fairly broad definition, but if you think about it, most special interest groups have different components to them. The environmental movement isn't just Greenpeace and the Sierra Club. It also includes research groups, sympathetic local chapters, academics who write on environmental topics, journalists who favor a more pro-environment policy, the same way that the Israel lobby does. It's not a centralized organization, and the groups that make up the Israel lobby do not agree on every single issue. It is certainly not a cabal or a conspiracy to control U.S. foreign policy. Again, it's just a powerful interest group that operates the same way other interest groups do here in the United States. Final point here, the lobby is not synonymous with Jewish Americans. Surveys suggest that about a quarter of Jewish Americans don't care that much one way or the other about Israel. Many others do not support the positions advocated by groups in the lobby, and of course some of the groups that work on Israel's behalf, such as the so-called Christian Zionists, are not Jewish. The lobby is defined by the political agenda it seeks to promote, not by ethnicity and not by religion. Finally, the lobby doesn't include anybody who happens to have a favorable attitude towards Israel. One has to actively work to try and influence American policy in a pro-Israel direction. Obviously, there are going to be some groups and individuals who are more active and more influential than others. So how does it work? Well, in the United States, interest groups are at the heart of our political process, and small groups with a focused agenda often wield disproportionate influence because they care a lot about a particular issue, and politicians can gain their support without losing anybody else's by going along with them. Like other interest groups, the Israel lobby works in two main ways. First, it operates inside the Beltway here in Washington, getting sympathetic people elected to office, appointed to key positions, and giving politicians clear incentives to support the positions it favors. Organizations like AIPAC work 24/7 to convince politicians to support their views. AIPAC's annual budget is about $50 million, and it's very active on Capitol Hill, helping draft legislation, providing talking points for congressmen, writing letters for them to sign to their colleagues. It's a highly professional, highly efficient, very impressive operation. AIPAC, however, is not, despite its name, a political action committee. It doesn't give money directly to candidates, but it does help vet candidates for office and steer campaign contributions from individuals and other pro-Israel political action committees. These committees, by the way, gave about $3 million to candidates in the last election cycle, and have given a total of about $55 million since 1992 to various candidates. By the way, that's not counting individual contributions, that's just the PAC money. And by way of comparison, Arab American political action committees, according to The Economist magazine, gave about $800,000 in that same period, 92 through 2006. So you get a sense of what the balance of power there is. Over the past 30 years, AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups have helped drive a number of prominent politicians from office, including Paul Finley, Pete McCloskey, Charles Percy, Cynthia McKinney, Roger Jepson, Lincoln Chafee. The lobby doesn't win every time, of course, but of course it doesn't have to if the purpose is simply to teach politicians that they are playing with fire if they go against their positions. And finally, that goes for presidential candidates too, of course. Now, all this is why Steve Rosen, the AIPAC official who is now under indictment for passing classified information, once put a napkin in front of a journalist from the New Yorker and said, in 24 hours we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin. Or as Senator Daniel Inouye explained when asked why he had signed an AIPAC letter, it's easier to sign one letter than to answer 5,000. Things are no different today. AIPAC was ranked number 2 in a National Journal survey of lobbies in 2003, tied with the AARP, by the way, and also ranked second in an earlier 1997 survey conducted by Forbes. Bill Clinton said AIPAC was, quote, better than anyone else lobbying in this town. Newt Gingrich, who didn't agree with Clinton on much, said it was the most effective interest group across the entire planet. Former Senator Fritz Hollings said, as he was leaving office, after announcing his retirement, you can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here. Or as Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said just last year, thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world. And again, it's not just AIPAC, it's also a number of other groups and individuals, including a subset of the Christian evangelicals. All right, so that's one strategy, operating inside the Beltway. The second strategy is to try and shape public opinion and public discourse so that Israel is viewed favorably by most Americans. Mainstream media tend to be strongly pro-Israel, especially in their editorial commentary and in terms of op-ed columnists and pundits. Compared with either Europe or with Israel itself, there's a much narrower range of views expressed on this subject in, say, the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, papers like that. If you look at commentators in the United States, there's no equivalent of, say, a Robert Fisk or a Patrick Steele, who write in the United Kingdom, and certainly no equivalent of Akiva Elder, Gideon Levy, Bradley Burston, or Myra Haas, all of whom write for Haaretz in Israel. My point, of course, is not that those critics of Israeli policy are always right, and that pro-Israel commentators are always wrong. That's not my point. It's rather simply that voices like theirs are largely absent from the mainstream media here in the United States. Even so, watchdog groups like the ADL or CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, monitor media coverage, organize boycotts and demonstrations against any news agencies that publish or broadcast anything critical of Israel. Groups like Campus Watch do the same thing on campus. And so when Jimmy Carter published his book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, the ADL and CAMERA took out ads in major newspapers, which included the publisher's phone number and invited readers to call in and protest the publication of the book. More recently, the Jewish newspaper Forward reported that CNN was coming under what it called unprecedented attack. That's the Forward's words, not mine or CNN's. Why? Because CNN broadcast a three-part series comparing Jewish, Muslim, and Christian fundamentalism. Some of you probably saw it. And the Forward also reported that the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations was urging its members to take up the issues with companies that had bought advertising time on CNN when the program was broadcast. Again, trying to get the message to CNN, don't do this again. Finally, efforts to stifle criticism often include smearing critics by accusing them of being anti-Semitic. Martin Peretz of the New Republic said that Jimmy Carter, quote, will go down in history as a Jew hater. A critic in the Washington Post said Carter's views in his book were similar to that of David Duke's. And by the way, of course, this is Jimmy Carter, who probably did more for Israeli security and for peace in the Middle East than any other American president. Needless to say, this was a common charge directed at us after our original article was published, even though there is not the slightest shred of evidence behind it. And smearing people in this way serves three purposes. First, it distracts people from the real issue, which is American policy in the Middle East. Second, it discourages other people from voicing criticisms, because who wants to get labeled with an epithet like that? And finally, it serves to marginalize people in the public arena. What politician would want to associate with anyone who'd been accused, even falsely, of being anti-Semitic? And some of you may have also noticed that Barack Obama got criticized a couple of weeks ago because he had Zbigniew Brzezinski as a foreign policy advisor. All right? Now, what was Brzezinski's great sin? He had written a very brief article saying some nice things about our original article. That was the only complaint about Brzezinski. Last point before I turn this over to John. Oh, well, bottom line here is that, of course, if any U.S. politicians are going to say anything remotely critical of Israel, and neither will anybody else who wants to have or wants to be a serious player in the making of American foreign policy. The result is, on this one issue, there's very little serious debate about support for Israel in the United States, especially in Congress, even when it's obvious to virtually everyone in both parties that American Middle East policy has gone badly off the rails. All right, now the last point before I turn this to John. Some will say that the United States backs Israel because there's such broad public support for this policy. Politicians are just doing what people want. And so groups like AIPAC and others are essentially superfluous. They are pushing on an open door. This argument is not persuasive for several reasons. It's true that Americans do have a generally favorable image of Israel, which, by the way, John and I do as well, in part because media coverage tends to be favorable, but they don't think the United States should be giving it unconditional or one-sided aid. A survey conducted by the Anti-Defamation League in 2005 found that 78% of Americans think the United States should favor neither side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Another survey reported by Americans for Peace Now found that 87% of Jewish Americans favor a two-state solution. And a poll by the University of Maryland in 2003 found that over 70% of what it called politically active Americans, that would be people like you, favored cutting aid to Israel if it refused to settle the conflict. So while Americans do have a generally favorable image of Israel, they want it to exist, they want it to be secure, they're not insisting that we back it no matter what. But of course, that's pretty much what American policy is, and the gap between what the people really want and what our policy is mostly due to the political influence of the various groups in the lobby, and especially organizations, the most powerful organizations, that don't represent the views of most Americans or even the majority of American views. So now the question is, what effect does this have on our foreign policy? Is the lobby's influence good for American policy in the region and good for Israel, or is it harmful to both countries? I'm going to leave that very easy question to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council also for inviting us here to speak tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear us talk. Steve has defined the lobby and made the case that it has a powerful influence on Middle East policy. What I'd like to do is take the analysis a step further and argue that its influence has been largely negative. In a nutshell, our argument is that the lobby, working with Israel itself, has pushed U.S. Middle East policy in ways that are not in the American national interest, and I might add, not in Israel's interest either. I will focus on two cases. First, how U.S. support for Israel's policies toward the Palestinians in the occupied territories has helped fuel terrorism against the United States. Second, I'll talk about the role of the lobby in the run-up to the Iraq War. There are three cases that we discuss in the book that I will not talk about because of time constraints. One is U.S. policy towards Iran, two is U.S. policy towards Syria, and three is U.S. policy during the Lebanon War in the summer of 2006. Let me start with America's terrorism problem. The conventional wisdom among Israel's supporters in the United States is that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians has little to do with why the United States is so hated in the Arab and Islamic world, and more importantly, little to do with our terrorism problem. In fact, Israel is said to be a valuable ally in the war against terror, surely America's most valuable ally in the Middle East. This received wisdom, however, is wrong. There is an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence which shows that U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and U.S. support for Israel's efforts to colonize those territories angers, if not enrages, huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The State Department, for example, set up an advisory group on public diplomacy in Arab and Islamic countries, which reported in June 2003 that, quote, citizens in these countries are genuinely distressed at the plight of the Palestinians and at the role they perceive the United States to be playing. Not surprisingly, that anger fuels terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize that Steve and I are not saying that our support for Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. We are simply saying that it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment tool for terrorist organizations. And it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The hostility towards the United States generated by Israel's policies in the occupied territories has been recognized by American presidents since 1967, when Israel first conquered Gaza and the West Bank. This is why the official policy of every administration since the Johnson administration has been to oppose the building of settlements. But no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements. Indeed, as Steve pointed out, the U.S. has protected Israel from criticism at the UN and given Israel more foreign aid than any other country and given it unconditionally. Of course, the reason that no president can put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop it from building settlement is the power of the lobby. A critically important issue when talking about America's terrorism problem is the matter of how U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians relates to what happened on September 11th. It is commonplace to hear Israel's supporters say that, one, Osama bin Laden did not care much about the Palestinians until recently. He only cares because it is an effective recruiting device. Two, the events of 9/11 had nothing to do with Israel. And three, those involved in the attack hated us because of who we are, not because of our Middle East policies. This line of argument is frequently purveyed by key figures in the lobby. For example, Alan Dershowitz maintains that, quote, prior to September 11th, Israel was barely on bin Laden's radar screen, end of quote. And Dennis Ross, who's now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, says that bin Laden was merely, quote, trying to gain legitimacy by implying that his attack on America was about the plight of the Palestinians, end of quote. These claims, however, are simply not true. It is clear from the historical record that bin Laden has been deeply concerned about the plight of the Palestinians since he was a young man. That concern was reflected in his public statements throughout the 1990s, well before 9/11. Consider what Max Rodenbeck, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, wrote in a review of 2 books about bin Laden, one of which was a compilation of his speeches. And I'm quoting Rodenbeck here. Of all the themes, the notion of payback for injustices suffered by the Palestinians is perhaps the most powerfully recurrent in bin Laden's speeches, end of quote. Regarding the actual attack on 9/11, we now know from the work of the 9/11 Commission that U.S. support for Israel was a major cause of the 9/11 attacks. It was not the only cause for sure, but it was a key cause. For example, the 9/11 Commission reports that bin Laden wanted to make sure that the attackers struck Congress because he saw it as the most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The Commission also reports that bin Laden twice wanted to move up the date of the attacks because of events involving Israel, even though he recognized that that might jeopardize the mission. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, consider what the 9/11 Commission says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it describes as the principal architect of the attacks. To quote the Commission report, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. It is hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role that U.S. support for Israel played in inspiring the 9/11 attacks. In short, the present relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is helping fuel America's terrorism problem. Let me now turn to Iraq. It's manifestly clear to most Americans at this point in time the war in Iraq is one of the greatest strategic blunders in American history. Our argument is that Israel, and especially the lobby, were 2 of the main driving forces behind the decision to invade Iraq. It is hard to imagine that war happening in their absence. To start with Israel, it was the only country besides Kuwait, which, as you remember, Saddam invaded in August 1990, the only country besides Kuwait where both the government and a majority of the population favored the war. The Israeli government, to include Prime Minister Sharon, pushed the Bush administration hard to make sure that it did not lose its nerve in the months before the invasion. Other influential Israelis, like former Prime Ministers Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, also implored the United States to take down Saddam. In fact, Israel was pushing so hard for the war that its supporters in the United States warned Israeli officials to damp down their rhetoric, lest it be seen as a war for Israel. One sometimes hears the argument that Israel opposed the war and actually favored attacking Iran instead. There is no question that in early 2002, when the Israelis first got wind that the United States was thinking about attacking Iraq, the key Israeli officials went to Washington and made it clear that they thought Iran was the greater enemy and that the Bush administration should focus on Tehran rather than Baghdad. It is important to emphasize, however, that Israel was not opposed to the United States toppling the regimes in either Iraq or Syria, two countries Jerusalem considers mortal enemies. Israel simply wanted the United States to deal with Iran first. But once the Israelis realized that the war party intended to deal with Iran after it finished the job in Iraq, it enthusiastically embraced the idea of invading Iraq. Thus, between early 2002 and March 2003, the Israelis put significant pressure on the Bush administration to make sure that it chose war over diplomacy with Iraq, while reminding Washington not to forget that Iran must come after Iraq. I might add that there is no evidence that Israel warned the United States that Iraq would turn into a quagmire, which is why, of course, they expected when the United States won its cakewalk victory in Iraq, it would quickly turn to Iran. Turning now to the lobby. There is no question that the Neoconservatives, one of the core constituencies in the lobby, were the main driving force behind the war. But they were supported by the key organizations in the lobby, like AIPAC. Now that the war has gone south, it is common to hear Israel's supporters say that the main organizations in the lobby did not push for war. But that is not true. This point is made clear in a May 2004 editorial that appeared in the Forward, a Jewish weekly that comes out of New York City. Let me read to you from the editorial. As President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Concern for Israel's safety rightfully factored into the deliberations of the main Jewish groups. That's an editorial from the Forward. Those are not the words of Steve Walt or John Mearsheimer. One sometimes hears the claim that AIPAC took no position on the Iraq war and certainly did not advocate it. That is not true either. First of all, this claim fails the common sense test, as AIPAC usually supports what Israel wants, and Israel certainly wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Second, there is hard evidence that AIPAC lobbied for the war. Specifically, AIPAC's executive director, Howard Core, told the New York Sun in January 2003 that one of, quote, AIPAC's successes over the past year, end of quote, was, quote again, quietly lobbying Congress to approve the use of force in Iraq. Again, that's Howard Core, the executive director of AIPAC. The Neoconservatives, of course, were the main driving force behind the war. They initiated the idea of using force to topple Saddam in 2 letters written to President Bill Clinton in early 1998. Over the next 5 years, and especially after 9/11, they pushed relentlessly for a war against Iraq. No other group or institution in the United States was seriously committed to invading Iraq, even after 9/11, but over that 5-year period. Indeed, there was significant opposition to invading Iraq within the State Department, the intelligence community, and the uniformed military. The neoconservatives are, by their own definition or their own admission, deeply committed to Israel. In fact, many of them are connected with the key organizations in the lobby, like the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Our argument here, it should be emphasized, is not that the neoconservatives or the leaders of the major organizations in the lobby were pushing a war that was in Israel's national interest, but was not in America's national interest. On the contrary, they believed that invading Iraq was in both America and Israel's national interest. For the neoconservatives, what is good for the United States is good for Israel, and vice versa. Although the neoconservatives were deeply committed to a war with Iraq, they could not make it happen by themselves. They failed to convince President Clinton to go to Baghdad, and they had little luck selling the war in the first 8 months of the Bush administration. It was the events of 9/11 that created the circumstances where they could help convince both President Bush and Vice President Cheney that invading Iraq was a smart idea. But without Bush and Cheney on board, there would not have been a war. All of this is to say, the neoconservatives were necessary to have the war, but by themselves, they could not make the war happen. Let me conclude with a brief word about what we think the U.S.-Israel relationship should look like. To start, the United States should end its special relationship with Israel and treat it as a normal country. The United States should treat Israel much the way it treats other democracies, like India, Britain, France, and Germany. In practice, this means when Israel is acting in ways that are in the American national interest, Washington should back the Jewish state. But when Israel is acting in ways that harm U.S. interests, Washington should distance itself from Israel and use its considerable leverage to get Israel to change its behavior, just as it would do with any other country that was acting in ways that might hurt the United States. Regarding Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, the United States should act as an honest broker. In other words, Washington should pursue an even-handed policy toward the two sides. In particular, the United States should make it clear to Israel that it must abandon the occupied territories and allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state on those lands. Jerusalem should be told that the United States will oppose, not tolerate, Israel's colonial expansion in the West Bank. None of this is to say that the United States should abandon Israel. On the contrary, the United States should defend Israel's right to exist within its pre-1967 borders with some minor modifications. And most importantly, if Israel's survival is threatened, the United States should come to its aid. Thank you.
We're not going to have time for that tonight, I don't think. question for Dr. Walt to get going. You discussed the difference in the discussion in the Israeli media about Israeli politics. And can you expand a little in the greater spread of the discussion within the Israeli mainstream media than in the United States? Can you expand on that a little bit and talk about that phenomenon?
Well, one of the, as the question implies, one of the more striking features of this is there's a much livelier debate on Middle East policy and on U.S.-Israeli relations, and certainly on Israel's policy, say, in the occupied territories, in Israel itself than there is here in the United States. And as I said in my former remarks, all you have to do is read Israeli newspapers to see that there is a quite wide range of discussion on both ends, in the middle, quite energetic, something that would be quite shocking if it started to happen here in the United States. Now, one can speculate on why that is the case, and I think the principal one is what I've alluded to already. Major media organizations in the United States know that if they print things that are critical of Israel, they're likely to face considerable firestorm of criticism from some of the key groups in the lobby. Does that mean that you never can see anything critical? No. In the United States, you will occasionally see guest op-eds that are critical. You will occasionally see some columnists, like, say, Richard Cohen of the Washington Post, who will criticize specific Israeli policies. But both our research in our book, the research of a number of other scholars who have looked sort of systematically at media coverage in the United States, suggest that it's clearly a much more one-sided picture here than you would find in Europe, than you would find in England, than you would find in Israel itself. And our view is that this is unfortunate because if we can't have an open discussion here, and if we don't have a wider and more diverse range of views expressed in the United States, we're not going to be able to figure out what an intelligent policy for the United States is, but we're also not going to be as good an ally to Israel. And one of the ways we could be a better ally to Israel is if we were actually less conditional in our support. We were able to give them better advice when they were making mistakes, which is something all states do. And if we had a more realistic conversation amongst ourselves about what policies would make sense. So this is one of these cases where I think truncating debate in the United States is not only harmful to the United States, but also harmful to Israel. I don't know if John wants to add anything to that or not.
Okay, let's start with this one. Could you comment on Leslie Gelb's observation yesterday that our affection for Israel makes sense because during the Cold War, the Arab countries sided with the USSR. I thought our pro-Israel stance helped to drive them into the Soviet embrace.
We say exactly that in the book. We concede in the book, or we make the argument in the book, that you can argue that Israel was a strategic asset during the Cold War because it played a key role in defeating Soviet client states like Egypt and Syria. And in the case of Syria, as Les Gelb said, it helped drive, in the case of Egypt, as Les Gelb said, it helped drive Egypt out of the Soviet orbit and into America's orbit. But the Cold War is over with, the Soviet Union is gone, and therefore you can't justify America's close relationship with Israel on the basis of the Soviet threat. And now what defenders of Israel try to do is make the case that Israel is an ally in the war on terror. But as I tried to argue up here at the podium a few moments ago, I think Israel is not an ally in the war on terror. It is a liability in the war on terror, and indeed it is one, and I want to underline the word one, it is one of the causes of our terrorism problem.
There are several questions here about the impact of the Israel lobby, what impact the Israel lobby is having on the current U.S. policy toward Iran.
I think that there's no question the United States has a difficult relationship with Iran, and it would have a difficult relationship with Iran if Israel did not exist. Right? There's a long history that doesn't have a lot to do with Israel between the United States and Iran. And it certainly is not in our interest, for example, if Iran were to become an active, fully manifest nuclear power with the nuclear weapons and all of that. So we would oppose that, it seems to me, even if Israel didn't exist. It's not the sole problem. That said, the question is, what should American policy be in dealing with Iran? And it seems to me at this point in time, if we can't persuade the Iranians not to acquire the whole fuel cycle, the next best thing is to try and persuade the Iranians not to go all the way to weaponize it, to end up with something kind of like Japan, where all of the necessary ingredients for a weapons program might exist, but they would choose, and there are actually good arguments from an Iranian perspective for not going all the way to weapons. And then the question is the best way to do that constantly threaten Iran with military force? Is that the way to persuade a country that it doesn't really want to have a deterrent of its own? Right? And my argument, and I suspect John's argument, would be that that's probably not the best way to do it. Certainly invading the country next door to Iran, right, as a way of showing that Iran really has nothing to worry about, is probably not the best way to persuade Iran not to acquire a deterrent of its own as well. So again, now the last point I would make, and that's the question about the Israel lobby, if you look and say, well, who in the United States is pushing hardest for the United States to contemplate the use of military force against Iran, it's not entirely these groups, but it is certainly most of the same individuals and organizations that pushed hardest to get us to go to Baghdad. It is really, in some sense, quite remarkable that the same groups and individuals, primarily the Neoconservatives, but not confined to them, who appear to be utterly unchastened by the results of their last big foreign policy prescription, right? And now are the ones leading the charge for going to war. Now, it's not going to happen if they don't persuade Vice President Cheney, President Bush to do it. Again, there's no secret conspiracy here that grabs control of our foreign policy. It's not just those groups that might favor this view. But I've made kind of the same argument that if we end up in a war with Iran, it will be in large part, not entirely, in large part because the same individuals that got us into a war with Iraq were able to persuade enough key officials that striking Iran was in our best interest as well. I think it will be a disaster, if not as big a disaster as the one we are currently facing in Iraq. It's still not the way to go. It's not going to solve ultimately our problems with Iran. And we lay out in the book what an alternative course would be that, again, is not an easy course to follow, might not succeed, but has a greater chance of success than a strictly confrontational policy or a policy of preventive war.
One additional sentence. There's only one country in the world that is pushing hard for the United States to use military force against Iran, and that is not surprisingly Israel.
Let's go back to the media for a moment. Dr. Walt, you assert that the U.S. media are blatantly pro-Israel. You did not, however, cite a reason or reasons. Is that from lack of evidence or simply an oversight? What are the reasons as you see them?
I'm just going to repeat. First of all, I didn't say blatantly pro-Israel. I said I believe that they tend to be pro-Israel. And secondly, I've already indicated what I think the principal reasons are, which is that most media organizations come under lots of pressure to not print things that are critical of Israel and not to print things that are suggesting alternative policy.
He's much quicker than I am on the uptake. It's not simply a function of age.
One could rephrase the question or the comment slightly differently, say, if Israel stops building settlements in the West Bank, there will be peace. I think you want to understand that this is not as simple. I mean, this question, I think, is more of a slogan than it is an analysis. We point out in the book that if the United States had a different policy towards Israel, it's not a wonder drug that makes all the problems in the region go away. Dealing with organizations like Hamas would be difficult even if the United States had a more conditional relationship with Israel. If we had a different policy, it doesn't mean that the doves will fly next week and everyone will live happily ever after. It just means that we would be able to make more progress towards that particular end. So yes, the Palestinians are going to have to agree to live in peace with Israel. The only other point I'd correct in this is that, the Palestinians do not pose an existential threat to the existence of the State of Israel. It's the strongest military power in the region. It has a nuclear arsenal of several hundred nuclear weapons. It's not going out of existence, no matter what some Islamic extremists might say, and John and I think that's wonderful. Right? The point is, what can it do to be able to live in peace with its neighbors and grant the Palestinians a viable state, which is what, of course, the Zionists wanted and what I believe the vast majority of the Palestinians want as well.
Military sales to Saudi Arabia and U.S. support of a Palestinian state suggests the Israel lobby is not so powerful. Comment?
Well, first of all, on U.S. support for a Palestinian state, there's no question that the Americans have supported the Palestinian state since the latter days of the Clinton administration. President Clinton was very interested in creating a Palestinian state. And in fact, Hillary Clinton in 1998 said that she thought the creation of a Palestinian state would do great things for stability in the region. And George Bush is clearly on record as favoring of a Palestinian state. So there's no question that at a rhetorical level, our last two presidents have been right on the money as to what is needed to shut down this conflict. But the problem is that they cannot put any pressure on Israel to stop colonizing the occupied territories. Just to give you a sense of what's going on here, between the signing of the Oslo Accords in the fall of 1993 and the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the fall of 2000, during that 7-year period, which we describe as the Oslo peace process, okay, the Israelis confiscated 40,000 acres of Palestinian territory. They built 250 miles of bypass roads in the occupied territories. They doubled the number of settlers in the occupied territories, and they built 30 new settlements. What did Bill Clinton and Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk know about this? Did they bring any pressure to bear on Israel to prevent this from happening? Did they put pressure on Israel to create a viable Palestinian state instead? No, they didn't. Look at George Bush. George Bush said after 9/11 that he was fully in favor of establishing a Palestinian state. Why? Because George Bush understood what I was saying up at the podium before is true. That one of the principal causes, not the only cause, one of the principal causes of our terrorism problem is this terrible situation with regard to the Palestinians. He wanted to create a Palestinian state. Has George Bush done anything of a meaningful sort to stop the Israelis from continuing to build settlements and to push the Israelis to accept the need for a viable Palestinian state? The answer is no.
On the Saudi, we try to make clear in the book that the groups in the Israel lobby are not all powerful, which means they don't win absolutely every battle. We sold AWACS to Saudi Arabia back in 1981. There was a big battle in the Senate, and AIPAC lost that particular battle. The Reagan administration won that one. Also, given the fact that the world economy still depends on oil, and given the fact that we worry about countries like Iran, we want to make sure that there is some level of stability in the Persian Gulf. It's not surprising that the United States occasionally decides to sell weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia. Not because there's an all-powerful Saudi lobby, but because we all like to drive SUVs, and other parts of the world consume oil too, and it's unfortunately important that oil keep flowing out of that region. By the way, I ride a bicycle to work, so I'm clean on this one. But again, the Israel lobby, although it's very influential, is not all powerful. And by the way, you'll also note that the Saudi arms package was accompanied by a 10-year commitment to increase military aid, not sales, aid to Israel over that 10-year period?
This one related a little bit to that one. Alan Greenspan and the anti-war movement both argue that the main drive or motivation for the Iraq war was for oil and that the oil lobby was behind the drive for war. What role did the Israel lobby play in the drive for the Iraq war, and what would you tell the anti-war protesters?
It's intuitively plausible to think that oil was the driving force, or certainly one of the main forces behind this war, because we obviously care greatly about the Middle East and the Persian Gulf in particular, because all of the oil that is there. But the question of whether or not oil was driving this war, whether the oil companies and the oil-producing states were pushing President Bush to invade Iraq, is an empirical one. Simple question here is, what does the historical record say? And the truth is, we have been able to find hardly any evidence that oil interests, to include the oil lobby and the oil-producing states, were pushing President Bush to invade Iraq. In fact, the oil-producing states warned against attacking Iraq. They were opposed to it. The oil companies, they didn't want to fight a war. They wanted to cut a deal with Saddam and make money. That's what the oil companies are all about. They're not interested in invading countries unless it's absolutely necessary, and they saw no reason to do this. So I would argue that if you look at the historical evidence, or the evidence that's now available, there's no good reason to support that claim. Now, one final point on this. A number of pro-Israel supporters, or a number of Israel's supporters, like to argue that we don't take into account other lobbies or other interest groups like Arab lobbies, the Palestinian lobby, the oil lobby, and so forth and so on. In fact, if you look at what many key players in the lobby themselves have said over the years about these other interest groups, it is clear that they understand that they have no opposition, that the Israel lobby has no real opposition. Douglas Bloomfield, who was a key figure in AIPAC, told the BBC in 2003 that one enormous advantage we have is that we have no opposition. Morris Amatei, who was formerly the director of, at the head of AIPAC, said that when you look at the oil companies and you look at the companies that produce weaponry in the United States, what you see is that they don't do serious lobbying in the realm of foreign policy. Yes, the oil companies are interested in lobbying for tax breaks and so forth and so on, but the oil companies do very little lobbying in the foreign policy realm. Why? Because they don't need to. The United States has a natural interest in protecting their interests and protecting oil in the Middle East. So I would argue that although this argument that Iraq was a war for oil, and although it seems to make sense that oil is the driving force behind U.S. Middle East policy today, when you look carefully at the evidence, it's hard to support that perspective.
This one about Al-Qaeda. How do you explain the fact that Al-Qaeda or Islamic terrorists have attacked European nations which have a more even-handed policy toward Israel?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of things to remember. Is Al-Qaeda itself is not a single unified organization, particularly now that the United States and others have gone after it. And therefore, it's not like Osama bin Laden is sitting in his cave issuing orders to the troops through some shadowy communication system. And that much of the Islamic terrorism we've seen, particularly in places like London, is motivated not just by, say, Middle East policy, but also by senses of alienation within those particular societies, something that has not been, fortunately, a problem here at home. The second point to notice is that some of the Islamic terrorism and Al-Qaeda terrorism, here I'm thinking of the attacks on Madrid, in Madrid, was motivated in part by support for the United States and support for the war in Iraq. It seems to have been, countries that were targeted because they had joined the so-called coalition of the willing, and there it was, in some degree, a reflection on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And that just gets back to a point that I hope John made clearly. We are not at any point suggesting that unconditional support for Israel is the only source of the terrorism problem. We are saying it is a critical or an important element of that, but it's clear that Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and others had other grievances as well. And, I'm not even willing to argue that if the United States had a different relationship with Israel, that everyone would come out of their caves and say, well, okay, all is forgiven now. Of course not. But it would make it easier to marginalize those individuals within the Arab and Islamic world. They would start looking much more like the criminals that they are, and not like heroic defenders of some national cause or some set of national pride. The smart strategy for dealing with them is to not give them recruiting tools, not to give them good moral arguments to use against us. And that's one of the other ways in which our current policy gets us into trouble.
Okay, here are two questions somewhat related. Arab lobbies have spent only $800,000, you indicated. What about all the Saudi oil dollars? Could it be that Middle Eastern Arab lobby, Middle Eastern/Arab armies have self-interests other than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And somewhat related, if there was a more powerful Arab lobby in the United States, do you think that would help offset some of the negative influences that these have on our government?
I want to make it clear, when I talked about Arab American PAC money, I'm talking about Arab Americans, people who give money to political action committees that are based in the Arab American population. And for a whole variety of reasons, they have been less well-funded, less influential, less politically savvy, I think, in some respects, than some of the groups that they oppose, and the numbers reflect that. The Saudis have public relations operations. They hire public relations firms in the United States to advance their image in the United States, sometimes to get breaks, weapons deals. They clearly hired lobbyists back in 1981 when they were trying to get the AWACS sale. But it doesn't have nearly the same impact as the Israel lobby, and it's for the obvious reason that this isn't indigenous. Right? It's easy to discredit or to marginalize as a foreign government come and hiring a public relations firm. By the way, something that lots of foreign governments do, right? It's hardly unique to the Saudis or anybody else, but it's not going to have the same political weight as any group of Americans, be they Jewish or non-Jewish, that organize in the United States, because again, we base our politics around interest groups. I'll let John answer the question of whether or not it would make a difference if Arab American groups were more influential.
I think the answer is obviously yes. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. I just wanted to make a quick point about the Saudis. It's very important to note that in 1990, 1991, the Saudis did help push the first Bush administration to war against Saddam in Kuwait. And in fact, Prince Bandar and Richard Pearl became fast friends during that period because both were pushing the United States to throw Saddam out of Kuwait. Our argument is that if you look at the situation in 2002, 2003, what you see is that there's no evidence that the Saudis or any of the oil-producing states this time around were pushing for war, or that the oil companies were pushing for war this time around. But you do see that the Neoconservatives were a major driving force. Again, not the only driving force, but a major driving force between 1998 and 2003.
This one that focuses on media. Are media owned by Jewish Americans part, in quotes, of the Israel lobby, or merely a target, in quotes, of the lobby? If there is a part versus target split, what percentage figures would you give each category, part among the Jewish-owned U.S. media?
I haven't done research on that specific secondary question, so I can't answer it. There are obviously some individuals in the media who have strong views on this subject, and like everybody else who owns a newspaper, they express those views. So Martin Peretz, it seems to me, the editor, longtime editor, and until very recently owner of the New Republic, has never made any secret of his views on Middle East policy. He once told someone, "I am in love with the state of Israel." And I think that's wonderful, and I think it is perfectly fine if he wants to write whatever he wants to write, print whatever he wants to print. That's the way things work here in America. Mortimer Zuckerman, another example, former president of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, owns U.S. News and World Report. Big surprise, U.S. News and World Report is not entirely in the middle on Middle East questions. And I think that's wonderful. That's perfectly okay. And of course, if someone wants to buy a newspaper or a television station and broadcast stuff that's all pro-Palestinian all the time, that would be fine too. This is America. We're allowed to have a marketplace of ideas, and anybody who owns a media outlet can do that. But I think the main thrust is not individuals who happen to own a newspaper or own a TV station or whatever. I think it's, as I said before, the fact that there are a whole range of organizations that put a lot of pressure on National Public Radio, on CNN, on ABC News. And again, if one talks to journalists, they're all aware of this and they're mindful of it.
Let me come at this question from a slightly different perspective. I actually don't like the question because it sort of implies that if you're Jewish and you own a newspaper, you're going to be part of the lobby, or you're going to be pro-Israel. And it's very important to emphasize that we're talking not about the Jewish lobby, we're talking about the Israel lobby. And the agenda of the lobby, the political agenda of the lobby is what defines it, not ethnicity or religion. And I would point out that Rupert Murdoch, who is not Jewish, is very pro-Israel. Okay? I would point out that Robert Bartley, the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, was not Jewish and was very pro-Israel. And as Steve pointed out, if you look at the survey data, there are a large number of Jews in the United States who don't feel any real attachment to Israel, number one. And then there are a large number of Jews in the United States who do feel the deep attachment to Israel, who think, much like Steve and I do, that the policies of the lobby are misguided. So I think it would be a mistake to sort of divide this world. I think this was implicit in the question, but if it wasn't, I apologize. To sort of divide the world into Jews and non-Jews and say Jews support Israel and non-Jews don't. It's a much more complicated picture than that. And that's why we talk about the Israel lobby, not the Jewish lobby. And it's why we were deeply bothered by the fact that the Les Gelb review in the New York Times that you referenced before, Heidi, constantly referred to the Jewish lobby, when in fact we went out of our way not to talk about the Jewish lobby. But for some reason, the Times editors and Les Gelb himself felt that it was appropriate to use the word Jewish lobby.
Here are three that are quite related. Why did the two of you decide to write this book, and what motivated you to take on such a controversial issue? And can you describe some of the difficulties you had in getting your article and the book published? Finally, has the publication of your book or the article affected your position in your university?
The last one is easy. No. As far as I know, it's had no effect on either of our positions. There was a story about whether or not I had been asked to step down as academic dean at the Kennedy School. As a result, there is absolutely no truth to that. My decision to step down occurred actually well before the article was published, and it was public knowledge at the school that was in my last year. As far as the other two things, I mean, John can correct my memory if I get this wrong. We first started talking about doing something on the Israel lobby in the spring of 2002. Well before the Iraq War debate was heating up. And we were primarily focusing on the American position in the Middle East post-September 11th and what could be done to try and improve America's overall standing in the region. We were then commissioned by The Atlantic to write an article in the fall of 2002, and with one thing or another, we didn't get the thing finished and into them until, I think, January 2005. At which point you'll recall there was a war in there that we did have to sort of pay a lot of attention to. And we were doing other things, and we have day jobs too. But in any event, it was then spiked by the Atlantic, and we looked around for some other venues for publishing it, either journals or possibly as a book, and didn't get much of a response anywhere. And it wasn't until the fall of 2005 that we then were given the idea by a friend to possibly publish it in the London Review, and that's where it all came from. I think that, and we wrote the piece basically because we felt that the United States was in increasing trouble in the Middle East, and there was an aspect of our problems in the Middle East that nobody was willing to talk about publicly, or very few people were willing to talk about publicly, particularly here in Washington, but also in other mainstream circles. And we wanted to try and blow some fresh air into this topic and let people have an honest discussion about our interests in the region, the different forces that were shaping it. So, in the sort of standard American tradition, by open debate as opposed to stifled debate, we might actually come up with a set of policies that would be better for us and better for all of our friends in the region, including Israel. Perhaps most importantly, Israel.
Swan, do you think that if the United States were to change its relationship with Israel, this would be viewed as a victory for the terrorists? How can that be balanced?
I don't think it would be seen as a victory for the terrorists. I don't know who the terrorists are here. We talk about the terrorists like there's this adversary out there similar to the Soviet Union. And I know people like to talk about Islamofascism and so forth and so on, but I don't find that to be a very helpful term. The Arab and Islamic world is a very variegated place. We have, and Israel has, a number of friends out there. People often like to talk about Israel as if it's a besieged nation, but the fact is that Israel has a peace treaty with Jordan, it has a peace treaty with Egypt, and it almost had a peace treaty with Syria in 2000, and according to President Clinton, it was Ehud Barak, not Hafez al-Assad, who walked away from the deal. So I think this idea that there is this sort of uniform threat that we're dealing with doesn't mesh with reality. Also, terrorism is just a weapon that different actors use when they really don't have another way of dealing with a more powerful foe. And I think that in the case of our terrorism problem, the terrorism problem that the United States of America faces, and the terrorism problem that Israel faces, if you created a viable Palestinian state, it would remove, in my opinion, the principal cause of Palestinian terrorism. They would then have something that they would lose if they continue to engage in terrorist activities. Finally, if you gave the Palestinians a viable state, it would greatly ameliorate, if not eliminate, Israel's problem with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. With regard to the United States, as I said when I talked earlier, I think that if we could shut down the Arab-Israeli conflict and create a viable Palestinian state, we would remove one of the principal causes of our terrorism problem. Of course, there are other problems out there like Hezbollah. Many of you would probably say, okay, he dealt with Al-Qaeda to some extent, he dealt with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but what about Hezbollah? I think Hezbollah is a reasonably easy problem to deal with. Many Israelis agree with me on this. I think what we ought to do there is get the Israelis to cut a deal with the Syrians on the Golan Heights, and then get the Syrians, who were promised that they would do this if they were given back the Golan Heights, to crack down on Hezbollah. And my point is, I think that there are various creative ways that the United States could do a lot to ameliorate its terrorism problem. And by pushing the Israelis to give the Palestinians a viable state would help greatly in that direction.
There are two that are somewhat related. First one, thank you for coming today. The question is, what institutional changes in the American political structure would facilitate a greater discussion, perhaps, on this subject? And as a young American, I've increasingly become disillusioned that this argument debate will extend beyond the confines of this room or beyond our informal office spaces. How do we, as the next generation, build effective dialogue and discussion, inform other young Americans, all Americans for that fact, and do it without being labeled anti-Semitic?
That's easy. Well, with respect to the first part, I think if you were able to dream sort of radical thoughts, campaign finance reform in the United States would greatly undermine the impact of all lobbies, right? And it would, in my view, be a good thing. I also don't expect that to happen in my lifetime because it would be opposed by not just the Israel lobby, but lots of other lobbies as well. Absent that, one of the things we say in the conclusion of the book is we are hoping to encourage also some rethinking on the part of some of the major organizations within the Israel lobby itself. I mean, if groups like Americans for Peace Now and in the Israel Policy Forum and others were more influential, and if groups like AIPAC began to realize that the policies they were pushing were not good for us and not good for Israel either, then you could have a very powerful pro-Israel lobby, but one that was pushing a set of policies that would make more sense, and that'd be just fine with me. With respect to the second half of the question, what can young people do? A, don't get disillusioned, please. We need you. Second, learn as much as you can about the history of the region or about regions that you do care about, because the history matters. Try and read all the sides that are there. And in particular, oppose and resist any efforts to sort of stifle free and open discussion of this. And that's, I think, the most important thing. And that doesn't say you have to agree with John or agree with me on this particular issue. Keep your minds open, listen to those who disagree with you, and most importantly, push hard to have this be an open conversation.
Did you feel an obligation or safer writing this book because you're Jewish?
That's a very simple question to answer. No, because neither one of us is Jewish. By the way, if we were, it wouldn't have made any difference. And in fact, one could have argued that the attacks on us, including the smears, would have been even more intense. As is evidenced by what's happened to Tony Judd, among others, over time.
Let's try this one first. Another Iran question. Israel and its supporters claim that Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. If, as you assert, the U.S. should defend Israel from threats to its existence, what should be the U.S. policy toward Iran with regard to Israel? Is there a real threat or not?
First of all, if you look at what Ahmadinejad has really said, he has not said that he's going to use military force to wipe Israel off the map. What he's talking about is hoping for a situation where Israel disappears much the way former Crusader states disappeared, or much the way, that's his language, not mine, or much the way the Soviet Union disappeared during the Cold War. He's not talking about using military force to achieve that end. Second point is, he does not have the authority in Iran to use nuclear weapons to attack Israel if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons. He is not the commander-in-chief. Furthermore, there are lots of people in Iran who I am sure would go to great lengths to make sure that he did not pull the trigger if he were so inclined to do so. Look, from Israel's point of view, it would be best if Iran didn't have nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. Just as it would have been in our interest during the Cold War if the Soviet Union didn't have nuclear weapons. We understood that very well. We had to run the Cold War all over again. Wouldn't you like to do it with us having nuclear weapons and them not having nuclear weapons? Of course. Okay? But the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the consequences of the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons, or what are the consequences of Iran having nuclear weapons? And the fact of the matter is that Iran cannot use those nuclear weapons against Israel without being incinerated. The Israelis have a survivable nuclear deterrent, and you cannot blackmail a state with a survivable nuclear deterrent. you all realize the Soviet Union had more nuclear warheads than we did during the Cold War. But they never tried to blackmail us, much less blackmailed us. And they never used nuclear weapons against us, and we, of course, never used nuclear weapons against them. Why? Because both countries would have been turned into smoking, radiating ruins. It's that simple. And if any country in the Middle East thinks that it is going to get away with attacking Israel with nuclear weapons, they're living in a dream world. Because Israel is not only going to turn Iran into a smoking, radiating ruin, it's going to turn every country in the region into a smoking, radiating ruin. They're going to take everybody else down with them. And the Iranian leadership, the Iraqi leadership, the Saudi leadership, you name it, they're all going to fully understand that. So there's no way, in my opinion, that any state, whether it's Iran or another, or an Arab state, is going to purposely use nuclear weapons against Israel. So if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's not the end of the world, and Israel is not going to disappear from the map of Europe.
Fine, USA. You did not mention the aid monies given to the PLO and where it went, and the result of our aid to the PLO democracy is to Palestine. Please show how Israel influenced this.
The United States has given various forms of economic assistance to the Palestinians over the years, and it's almost certain that some of that money got diverted in various ways because the PLO was a pretty corrupt organization. I don't think, Israel obviously didn't directly influence that, but and by the way, we now see a consequence where there's essentially internecine struggle approaching civil war between Fatah on one side and Hamas on the other. But again, I would, without saying the Palestinians are blameless in this, because I think Palestinian leaders have made a number of really serious errors, it's also worth noting what has happened, say, over the past 15 years or so. And John recounted some of this, but I'll just remind everybody that in 1992, about the time the Oslo Accords were signed, most estimates are that Hamas had about 15% support within the Palestinian population. Now, after we go through the Oslo period and the settler population doubles and the roads are built and the land is confiscated, and we get to the elections in 2005, Hamas wins the elections with 45% popularity. So the failure to achieve a viable Palestinian state, the failure to seize the opportunity presented by the Oslo Accords, is one of the reasons we have a serious Hamas problem now. And one of the reasons, of course, we have the deep division that now exists within the Palestinian community. By the way, a division that I believe we exacerbated by pushing for the election, and then, of course, once we didn't like the result, doing everything we could to try and negate that result, right? And eventually, of course, doing everything we could to try and encourage the repression of Hamas. And I say that as not someone who is trying to defend Hamas as an institution or defend its positions as an organization. But as a realist here, it seems to me if what you really want to have is peace in that part of the world, you can't just deal with the ones who agree with you. You're going to also have to negotiate and persuade the people who don't deal with you or don't agree with us right now. It seems to me the only chance of doing that is if you can hold out the prospect of, again, a viable Palestinian state actually happening in a meaningful way sometime in people's lifetimes, right? And then be able to marginalize anyone who is genuinely standing in the way of that particular objective.
Just very quickly, it's important to emphasize that the PLO did not get any assistance from the United States until it recognized the state of Israel. And of course, that's the same basic policy that the United States employs towards Hamas. So, not only did the United States, but Israel had no problem. Israel had no problem with us giving aid to the PLO as long as the PLO accepted Israel. One further comment on this, which is very important to emphasize, is that the first Intifada broke out, the first Intifada in December 1987. And at the time, Arafat and the PLO were in Tunis You all remember in 1982, the Israelis invaded Lebanon, where Arafat was located, and they drove him out of Beirut and sent him to Tunis. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, how did Arafat end up leaving Tunis and coming back into the Palestinian territories? The answer is the Israelis brought him back. And the reason the Israelis brought him back is that they understood that the leaders of the first Intifada were very tough hombres to deal with. They were very smart and very sophisticated, a lot like the Israelis themselves. The Israelis decided that what they wanted to do was bring Arafat back, because, to put it in colloquial terms, he would be easy to take to the cleaners. You should understand that there are many people in the Arab world who were deeply critical of Arafat and his acceptance of the Oslo Accords, because they believed that the Israelis were taking Arafat, so to speak, to the cleaners. Okay? But the idea that the Israelis did not like Arafat and viewed him as an adversary and were opposed to giving him any aid at all is not true. Later on, after Camp David, they demonized Arafat, for sure. But that was not the case in the period of the 1990s, when the Israelis were perfectly willing to deal with Arafat. And you remember I told you about all those roads the Israelis built in the West Bank, all the land they confiscated, all the settlements they built, all the settlers they sent into the West Bank and Gaza. You know who was running the Palestinian side of the equation at that point in time? Yasser Arafat. That's why they brought him back.
Okay, here's one question. How does the failure to take live questions advance discussion of an issue that you label as taboo? And I'll take the first part of that answer, because we knew we'd have an awful lot of questions tonight, and the speakers have to be on planes, so we have to leave quite promptly at 8 o'clock, or they have to leave quite promptly at 8 o'clock, and we thought that this would be the best way to get through the largest number of questions quickly, which we have done. We have a few more minutes left if you'd like to take some live questions. Now, please wait for the microphone and try not to re-ask the same questions that have already been addressed.
My name is Kay Halpern. I actually submitted a written question, but I guess it hasn't been brought up yet. Anyway, my question is this. You referred to Hamas, you spoke about Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and that if there were a viable Palestinian state, then that my understanding of your response was that those two groups would essentially be marginalized. And so my question is, do you think that Hamas would accept a two-state, or Islamic Jihad for that matter, but more importantly, Hamas would accept a two-state solution?
A couple points on that. At the time of the Oslo Accords, Hamas enjoyed about 15% support on the level of 15% among the Palestinian population. It did not have a lot of support. By 2005, when it came to power, it enjoyed roughly 44%. There was a threefold increase in support among the Palestinians for Hamas. The reason for this increase in support was, as I described, because of what the Israelis were doing in the 1990s. And Arafat, of course, was, as Steve pointed out, corrupt, and he was in effect complicit with what the Israelis were doing. So the Israelis have gone to great lengths to delegitimize Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, Fatah, and the end result is, not surprisingly, Hamas has become increasingly stronger with the passage of time. We believe that Hamas is a problem. Islamic Jihad is a problem. There is a real problem there. But we believe that if you were to get the Israelis to a point where they were willing to countenance, seriously countenance, giving the Palestinians a viable state of their own, you could marginalize Hamas again, and you could get the Palestinians who accepted Israel's legitimacy to not only run this new state, but crack down on Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And if you look at the number of suicide or terrorist attacks against Israel in the latter part of the 1990s, they're remarkably few in number. And that's in large part because Arafat, despite the fact that he was not terribly competent, was able to crack down on terrorism. So again, I think the key here to isolating Islamic Jihad and Hamas and dealing with the terrorism problem is to create a state. But it's definitely a much harder nut to crack today than it was in 1993.
Back here at the back.
Thank you.
The gentleman behind you and then you.
Thank you. You've raised an issue here that has the most important national consequences. The failure of the U.S. Congress to address this and the public's ignorance of the consequences of all of this. Have you been asked by any members of the Congress to come up to the Hill to discuss this issue? Do you expect that to happen? And if you were asked, what would you expect to be your participation?
We have not been asked. I don't expect to be, but if asked, I'm sure we would go up there and participate however the Congress would find helpful. Yeah, there's a blank check.
Bill Voice, Voice of America. My question is really more for the World Affairs Council, but for you as well. We've heard all night tonight about the influence of the Israeli lobby, yet this meeting happened. Was there any attempt to prevent it from happening? I mean, I was very surprised when I came here, there were no people demonstrating out front. I assumed there would be, but they're not. At least they weren't when I came. And I think, in a way, for me, it's a good sign that this free discussion has happened. And I want to thank you for organizing it. But again, I'm interested if there were any attempts to dissuade you from doing this.
No, I'd have to say there really weren't any attempts to dissuade me from this. We had a couple of emails suggesting that we invite someone to balance the panel out, and my response to that was, this is an author event. The World Affairs Council has author events throughout the year, and we present authors who have written books that are we think are going to be widely read and have a lot of interest in them. And to my knowledge, the World Affairs Council has never presented an author event with a balanced panel. We have panel discussions that we try to be balanced on any number of subjects and foreign policy issues, but this is an author event.
Thank you.
I was curious about the comment that you made near the end that Israel should give up the West Bank. That area has a lot of Jewish history and a lot of Jewish historical sites, including the Wailing Wall. And from what I have seen, the Muslims in general and the Palestinians in particular have destroyed other cultures' historical sites. Like they destroyed the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem. After the first Arab-Israeli war, and they destroyed Joseph's tomb and made it into a mosque, and they destroyed the ancient synagogue in Jericho. Why should Israel give up territory that is so important in Jewish history when they're taking a major chance on these historical areas being destroyed?
Well, the main reason that they should give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and create a viable Palestinian state is so that they can live in peace with the Palestinians and get this conflict off their back. That's the simple reason. Now, I think that there is no question that when you look at the West Bank, you see evidence of lots of Jewish history. Nobody would deny that. And nobody would deny that there have been cases where the Palestinians have destroyed certain Jewish sites. that's agreed. But the fact of the matter is that the land that is now Israel, not too long ago, belonged to the Palestinians. And the Jews came out of the Pale settlement in Europe, and they took that land from the Palestinians. You want to remember that in about 1900, when the Jews began to come out of Europe in large numbers and go into Palestine, there were very few Jews in that area of the world. And the land was owned by a large body of Palestinians, a large number of Arabs. And the Jews who came from Europe, and this includes people across the political spectrum, from David Ben-Gurion to Vladimir Jabotinsky, all understood that to create a Jewish state in a sea of Palestinians or a sea of Arabs, they were going to have to take their land and do terrible things to them. Common sense tells you that there was no other way you could create a Jewish state. So you had hundreds of Arab or Palestinian villages in what is now Green Line Israel, or pre-1967 Israel, that the Israelis destroyed and turned into Jewish towns or Jewish villages or Jewish cities. So both the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews, or the Zionists, call them what you want, have engaged in this form of behavior for sure. And our basic point here is this is tragic, but the question is, where do we go from here? How do we shut this one down? And the point is that the Zionists or the Jews got 78% of Mandate Palestine, and there's 22% left. That's basically what the Gaza Strip and the West Bank represent, the remaining 22%. And we're arguing that with some minor adjustments to account for the major settlement blocks in the West Bank, the Palestinians should get most of that remaining 22%. And that both the United States and the Europeans, and even the Israelis, if they can, should go to great lengths to help create a viable Palestinian state. Because, as I said in response to your question at the beginning, it just makes eminently good sense for Israel to shut down this conflict once and for all, and to become as much as possible a normal country.
I want to add just a little quick point to that, and that's just to say you have to also think of what the alternatives to what John just sketched out for the future are. It seems to me the alternatives look like this. Israel could try to expel the rest of the Palestinians off the West Bank and Gaza. I don't think anybody really wants to openly advocate that. You could create a binational democracy between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but that means getting rid of the Jewish state, and we support the existence of a Jewish state. There's lots of other practical reasons why that's not very appealing, but you could try that. But then the only thing left is some form of apartheid, where Israel continues to control the occupied territories, but denies the residents of the occupied territories political rights. Right? Now, those are the alternatives to a two-state solution. I can't think of any other alternatives to a two-state solution. If you want one of those alternatives, raise your hand and tell me why you're in favor of it. But otherwise, it seems to me we're left with a two-state solution, and that's what we in the United States should be doing everything we can to make happen in a way that's good for both sides.
I think that's going to have to be the last word. We will sign